All right, go. Good evening. Good afternoon. This is rare. This feels like Shabbos almost. We are learning Daf Tes tonight. The Amud Aleph of Daf Tes is looks pretty long, and if you look on Daf Tes Amud Beis, you'll see a Rashi that begins about 10 lines down. Ari, grab a picture sheet. The Rashi on Daf Tes Amud Beis begins about 10 lines down and goes for about 4,000 lines. It's exceedingly long. It happens to be a gorgeous and clear Rashi depicting how to best understand our Mishnah. So when you have time, and it will not be now, but when you have time, it's kedai just to read one of those cases to see how Rashi in perfect form articulates what's going on in our Mishnah. But before that, we have to close out one last sugya, and that is starting 2/3 of the way down on Ches Amud Beis at the two dots. Yesterday, in argument against Rava, we brought a brisa in the name of Rebbe. And here's what the brisa had said at the two dots. Gufa, in the name of Rebbe, it says, Rebbe Omer, really, the pasuk could have said vilakach, but instead it said ulekacha. It could have said v'yabeim, and instead the pasuk said vayibma. So how do we understand this pasuk? So Rebbe had said, le'esor tsaros ve'arayos. He said that each of these psukim are teaching us that there are times that a tzara will be asura, and there are times that an arayos will be asura. This was the question that we asked against Rava. Without going into too much detail, Rava had said that we don't need a pasuk for arayos. This brisa was brought to say, clearly we need a pasuk for arayos because the Gemara brought a pasuk for arayos. Fine. The Gemara is bothered by this. How can you learn out tzara from this pasuk? Midei tsaros. Ksiva hacha. Do you see the word tzara being discussed in this pasuk? How can you learn from this pasuk? Asking a question on Rebbe. How could you say that tzaros is being learned from this pasuk? A tzara is not mentioned in this pasuk. Not only that, a tzara is mentioned in a different pasuk. And furthermore, tzaros militzror nafka. We know the pasuk already speaks about a tzara, and it's not in the brisa, the pasuk that's mentioned in the brisa with Rebbe of vilakachu lekacha and v'yabeim v'yibma. So what is Rebbe talking about? So to get out of one problem, the litzror, the pasuk that does speak about tzara, so that Rebbe learns differently. Litzror, mapikle Rebbe lichad Reb Shimon. Rebbe learns the word litzror for an atypical situation, not about a classical tzara, for the case of Reb Shimon. What is Reb Shimon's case? So take a look at Rashi halfway down. Dibur hamaska lichad Reb Shimon. The Parak Dalet Achen. We're going to learn about this later in the Masechta. We're just going to read a little bit. Okay, don't worry. We're not going to draw out the case here. What's the case that Rashi says here? Gimel Achen. There are three brothers. Shnai mehen nesuin, shtei achayos. There are two brothers who are married to two sisters. O isha ubita, or a woman and her daughter. One is married to one is married to the other. And then umesu, and then there was a case of yibum. And if you go through this whole Rashi, you'll see that there's a case of a tzara there. Yeah, we're not going to go into these. I'm just highlighting that case we'll learn on Daf Kal Ches. But that's how Rebbe learns the litzror. So we don't have a classical case of tzara. So tzara, Heicha ksiva, the language should be heicha ksiva. That's corrected by the Yevamos on the side here in the Gilyon. Heicha ksiva. So how then do we understand this pasuk to be speaking about a tzara? The pasuk that Rebbe quoted is not talking about a tzara. So the Gemara responds, hachikama. This is really how we can understand the pasuk. Im kain, if it's not meant to speak about a tzara, lema kra v'lakach. It should have just said v'lakach without the hey. Mai ulekacha. It must be that kol heicha deika trei lekuchen, that whenever a husband or a yavam in this case has an opportunity to marry two women, one an erva and one a tzara, the ibai nasif high, in a case where he can marry one or the other, then sharia, then it would be permissible for him to marry one of them. The ilo tarvaihu asiran. Basically, we're making a deal that because there's an extra hey, that we're able to learn out a tzara. How do we learn out the second part of the pasuk? V'yibma, b'makom yibum, when there is a case of yibum, hu de asira tzara. That is when the tzara is going to be forbidden. The tzara is forbidden through the Yevama, right? So if let's say that the Yevama, the actual Yevama is an arayos, so Shimon cannot marry that woman because it's his daughter, but the tzara is not related. So the only reason the tzara is going to be usher is because there's yibum happening. Shelo b'makom yibum sharia tzara. However, if it was not to be a case of yibum, then the tzara would be permitted. That's totally fine. Let's say, for example, that Ruvain married Shimon's daughter, and Ruvain married Malka, a random woman from the community. And then they had kids. So then there's no Yibum. So then if Ruvain dies, then Shimon can marry the Tzara. No problem at all. That's totally fine. The only time that it's problematic is when Yibum takes place. That's when a Tzara comes up. Now, all of this is according to Rebbe. And if the Gemara in the Brisa mentions Rebbe, it also therefore assumes that there is a dissenting opinion. And that in this case is the Rabbanan, 8 lines from the bottom of Chesed Beis, trudging along, trying to figure out exactly how all the psukim work here. The Rabbanan, how do the rabbis understand these psukim? Hai ulekacha, my avadle, my avdile. How does the Rabbanan understand this? So says the Gemara, Mi boile lichet Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina. He says that the psukim that Rebbe uses of ulekacha, we need them to teach us something that Rabbi Yossi taught us. What did Rabbi Yossi teach us? Dama Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina ulekacha. What does that teach us? Malamed shemegarsha begeru machzira. That once a woman is married b'yibum, she no longer has any other uniqueness to her as it relates to being married. She'd have to get divorced regularly, and if she'd get remarried, she'd have to get remarried with all of the regular rules of Yibum. Yibum is a flash in the pan as it relates to this woman. The second she's married derech Yibum, she's no longer a Yevama anymore. She's just a regular woman. And Rabbi Yossi, Reb Chanina learns that out from this word of lekacha. And that's why he argues with Rebbe. Rebbe's learning out these gross ideas about Arab. He's like, stop. All I'm saying, says Rabbi Yossi, Reb Chanina, all I'm saying is that this woman, once she completes her marriage, derech Yibum, she is now a regular woman all the way. V'yavama, what is v'yibma? What does the word v'yibma mean? So v'yibma is the verb of getting married, and the Gemara says a very sharp line, al korcha, to teach that she will become married even if the intimacy, even if the bia under those circumstances was al korcha, was against her will. It's not to say that that's the right thing to do, of course. It's just to say that the mechanism of tashmish amita, bia, in this case, that is going to cause that marriage to be effective. The Rebbe, where does Rebbe learn this out from? Rebbe who doesn't learn the psukim this way, because we said that Rebbe learned the psukim of Yibma and Ulekacha to teach us about Arayos and Tzara. So then, the Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina, where does he learn out the idea of Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina? So where does he learn out the idea that a woman, once she's already married, derech Yibum, that she's considered like every other woman? So the Gemara responds, Mila Isha Nafka. It comes out from a different pasuk. And Al Korcha, where does he learn that from? Mi Yevama Yavo Aleha Nafka. He learns that out from another pasuk, that as long as there is any form of intimacy, even if the intention wasn't marriage, at the end of the day, she is going to be married. Okay, now let's just get to the last little piece of this, and then we're going to switch into a real Yibum sugya. Let's go. The Rebbe, Hai Aleha my Avidle. Now Rebbe learned our sugya altogether differently. So when we have the pasuk of Aleha, which was to teach us that a man cannot marry his daughter or any of the arayos, we had the word Aleha, but Rebbe doesn't learn that way. So what does he do with the word Aleha? So it says the Gemara, Mi Baile Lichadetanya. It's really Lichadetnan. It's not a brisa, it's a Mishnah. He needs it for the following Mishnah. That this Mishnah seems like it's out of left field. It's a Mishnah that speaks about what happens when a group of people or a Nasi or a Kohen Mashiach or an individual does an Aveira. And we're going to learn something from our case of Yibum back to that case. So that's the structure of the next many lines. So what does the brisa say? Ein chayavin bezdin, a bezdin that gives a psak in error, they will not be chayiv to bring their korban. What is their korban called? Look at the last line of Rashi. Rashi says, "Ein chayavin al bezdin lahavi par shel he'elam davar." We refer to this korban as par he'elam davar shel tzibur. So says the Gemara, back in the Gemara, 2 lines from the bottom, "Ein chayavin bezdin el al davar shezdono kares v'shigagaso chatas." That when do we say that a bezdin who gives a psak to the public in error has to bring the par he'elam davar shel tzibur? That's only in a case when the psak that they give out would have been on purpose a chiyuv kares and would have been by accident a chatas. And the same applies by a Kohen who gives the wrong psak, b'chein ha-Mashiach. Here the Mashiach is a reference to the Kohen Mashiach. If he gives out a psak that is really not correct, the only time he has to bring a korban is if it's zedono kares and shigagaso Mashiach, shigagaso chatas. That if the psak would have been that had it been on purpose, he would have been chayev kares, and had it been that it was done b'shogeg, then that action was done b'shogeg, he would be chayev chatas. This brings us to the top of Daf Testament Aleph, and as well below ba'avodas kochavim, there's a different category of halacha when a bezdin gives a psak stam versus when bezdin gives a psak about avodah zarah. So if that psak was about avodah zarah, below ba'avodas kochavim, here too by avodah zarah, when would one be obligated to bring the korban of par helam davar shel tzibur? So says the Gemara, that's only true if the psak that was given about the avodah zarah was ela al davar shechayav and al zdono kares v'shigagaso chatos. So 3 for 3. When it comes to a case of bezdin, when it comes to a case of the Kohen Mashiach. And when it comes to the case of Bezdin Paskening in the case of Avodah Zarah, in all of these cases, the only time that a korban would have to be brought for this error psak is in a case where that which was paskin, had it been done on purpose, would be chiyuv kares, and had it been done by accident, there would be a korban chatas. That's Mishnah number 1. Mishnah number 2, second line of Testament Aleph. It's not nami. We have another Mishnah in a similar vein. Kol mitzvah shebetorah shechayav al zono kares v'ashigaso chatas. In any case scenario where there is a mitzvah in the Torah, which had it been done on purpose would be chayav kares, and had it been done by accident would be chayav chatas, then yachid, if it's an individual who made this error, let's say that I did this on my own, right? We've all done this before. So then maybe kispa or seira, those are the animals, one of those animals that you'd have to bring as a yachid. What if it was a nasi? If it was a nasi, one of the leaders, the top posek in town, right, the biggest dayan in town, so then maybe he'd have to bring a korban on behalf of the community. Mashiach, if it was the Kohen Mashiach and he gave a psak out that was not good, and Bezdin, that would be true of both of them. So then Mevi and Par, they have to bring a cow. What if the psak was related to Uve Avodas Kochavim, if it was related to Avodah Zarah? So then in that case, says the Gemara, Yachid Nasi, Mashiach, these three people, an individual, the top dayan in town, and the Kohen Mashiach, if they made this error, Mevi and Seira, they'd bring this female animal. Had it been the whole tzibur, then Mevi and Par v'Sayir, they bring two animals, Par la'ola v'Sayir l'chatas. And says the Gemara, Minahani Mili. How do we know that the common denominator of when we bring a korban is in a case of Zidono Kares and Shigigaso Chatas? How do we know that the only time we bring this korban is had it been that I did this activity intentionally, I'd be Chayav Kares, and if I did it accidentally, it would have been a Chiyuv Chatas. Where do we know this from? Says the Gemara, and now we're circling back to our sugya, to Tanu Rabbanan, because the rabbis taught us. And then it became known the Avera that they did. The word chatu is going to become important in a moment. And says the Gemara as follows. Rebbe Omer, ne'emar kan aleha. It says over here, by the korbanos of a mistaken activity, a mistaken psak, it has the word aleha. And Minamar Lahalan, it also says by Yibum, it also says the word Aleha. Oh, so this is what Rebbe uses the word Aleha for. Just like when it comes to Yibum, we're talking about a case where had the activity been done b'mezid, it would be a chiyuv kares, and had it been done b'shogeg, it's a chiyuv chatas. Afkan, here too, by bringing korbanos for an erroneous psak, a mistaken psak, it's only in a case of davar shechayav al zono kares v'al shigagas chatas. So that's what Rebbe does with the word Aleha. Let's just summarize this piece very quickly. We didn't know how Rebbe used the word Aleha. We knew how everybody else used the word Aleha, which was to teach us that a Shimon cannot marry his daughter derech yibum. Fine, that's how we all learned it. But what does Rebbe do with that word? Because he learns differently. So says the Gemara, we learn from here to another world about where there was a mistaken psak that was given, that just like by Yibum, that the only time that Yibum would be a case of Issers, where there's a case of Zedono Kares and Shigigaso Chatas, the same is true here. Then the Gemara says, we're a quarter of the way down, a little bit less, about 15 lines down on Testament Aleph. Ashkechan Sibur. This pasuk says chatu, asher chatu, that they sinned. That represents the Sibur. So I know from over there that they have to bring a korban. That makes sense. However, Mashiach Minolan. How do we know that Mashiach is subject to the same criteria of Shigigaso Chatas, of Zedono Kares and Shigigaso Chatas? So Mashiach Minolan answers the Gemara. Dechsiv b'Mashiach la'ashmas ha'am harei Mashiach ketzibur. If you look in that pasuk on the side, it'll show you that there's a similarity to a Kohen Mashiach and the Tzibur, and therefore they're treated the same in that the only time that a Kohen Mashiach is going to be obligated to bring this korban is if it was Zedono Kares and Shigigaso Chatas. What about Yachid v'Nasi? Those are not represented in the pasuk. So that we learn from Gzer Shava Asi Mitzvos, that they too are going to be subject to the same rules, that the only time that they bring a korban is if in fact they had a case of Zedono Kares and Shigigaso Chatas. What about Avodas Kochavim? Avodas Kochavim wasn't spoken about in this pasuk, so how do we know that they share the same parameter, the same threshold of when to bring a korban? Says the Gemara, V'lo b'Avodas Kochavim. How do we understand that? Says the Gemara, Ela al davar shechayav al Zedono Kares Shigigaso Chatas. How do we know that? Because Tzibor b'Avodas Kochavim yalif me'enei. Another Gzer Shava. So we've checked off all of these boxes that in regards to a regular Avera and in regards to Avodas Kochavim, that we have almost all of our answers as to why it is that everyone has the same rule, that it's only a korban is only brought if the error of the psak or the error of your action was one that was Zedono Kares v'Shigigaso Chatas. A couple more things to check off by Avodah Zarah. Yachid Nasi Mashiach me ve'im nefesh achas. We learn out a Yachid and the Nasi, the top posek of Mashiach and the Kohen Mashiach, that they too are subject to the same parameters by Avodah Zarah from the pasuk of ve'im nefesh achas. Echad Yachid ve'echad nasi, ve'echad Mashiach b'mashma. It implies that based on the pasuk, v'im nefesh achas, if any one person, these are all one people, a yachid and a nasi and kohen Mashiach. And what does the vav of v'im nefesh achas teach me? Vav mosif al inyan rishon. Vav adds to what we were learning about previously. V'yelamed tachton min ha'elyon. We can learn the tachton, that which is lower, from that which is higher. Namely, we can learn from tzibur to yachid, and that's how the Gemara extends to all of the cases we've discussed. We've discussed three categories of halacha, which is the first category of halacha, which is quoted in the Bryce, is when Bezdin makes an error. The second is when the Kohen Mashiach makes an error, and the third is when there's an error of avodas kochavim. And within each of those parameters, we spoke about tzibur, yachid, we spoke about a nasi, we spoke about kohen mashiach, all the different characters, and all of that, they all have the same parameter. In all case scenarios, this is a good piece of information to remember. Please God, Beis Hamikdash should be rebuilt very soon. If ever we are obligated to bring a korban because of a mistaken psak, the rule is that it must be a scenario where it is Zadono Kares and Shigigaso Chatas. A little bit more than a third of the way down on Testament, the Gemara says that's great and everything, but that doesn't help us with everyone. Where do the rabbis learn out this idea of Zidono Karetz V'Shigagaso Chatas? Says the Gemara, it's learned out. Nafkaluhu, the rabbis learned it out. Mikre le Rabbi Yoshua lebre, because of what was taught from Rabbi Yoshua to his son. What was taught to them? Torah achas yelachem le'oseh bishkagav v'nefesh asher ta'aseh biyad ramah. That is what the pasuk says, that there's one Torah that will be for you, to those who make an error, those who do an isser shogeg. V'nefesh asher biyad ramah, and a person who does an avera biyad ramah. This is a reference to avodah zarah, to do an avera biyad ramah. And the Gemara applies a hekesh. Huksha kol Torah kula la'avodas kochavim. All of Torah was made equal, at least in one way, to avodas kochavim. Ma avodas kochavim davar shechayav al zadono kares val shigigaso chatas av kol davar shechayav al zadono kares val shigigaso chatas. So now we found yet another parameter according to the Rabbanan now, because all of that was really according to Rebbe. That's how he used the word aleha. So where do the Rabbanan learn this out? Because the Rabbanan use the word aleha for our case. So how do we learn these halachos? So the Gemara answers with this hekesh. Fine. That pasuk seems to be speaking about in the singular because it says v'hanefesh asher ta'aseh. And it's so then therefore the Gemara asks, Ashkechan Yachid Benasi Mashiach Bein Avodas Kochavim Bein Shar Mitzvos. I know that this rule of Zadono Kares and Shigigaso applies across the boards, Avodas Kochavim regular mitzvos by anyone who's an individual. What about Tzibur B'Avodas Kochavim Minayin? What about its Tzibur as it relates to Avodah Zarah? So Amar Kra says the Gemara, V'im Nefesh. From there, from the vav, from the extra word letter, we can learn from one to the other to apply the rules of a yachid to a tzibur as well, to say that the threshold is again the same. That the only time that korban is brought, according to the Rabbanan, is when it's shigigasa, is when it's Zadono Kares and shigigaso chatas. tzibur meshar mitzvos minal an yalif. Now you've answered the question about the tzibur by avodas kochavim. What about tzibur by shar mitzvos? Says the Gemara, gzera shava me'enei me'enei. What does Rebbe do with the pasuk of Hai Torah Achas? It says the Gemara, Rebbe Hai Torah Achas my avidei. We know how the rabbis use it. The rabbis use it to teach us the halacha, but you already learned it from somewhere else. So how is he going to use this pasuk? Says the Gemara, because of another brisa. And this is how Rebbe uses the pasuk of Torah Achas. Because it's very clear from the psukim that there's a difference between a yachid and a tzibur, different drushos, some for one and some for the other, and therefore yachidim beskila, and their individuals may be subject to a punishment in theory of skila, lefichach mamonan palat. This is a side din, really. But when a person is given the capital punishment of skila, then there is no fiscal punishment that's given to them. Their children can still take their money, be Yerusha. However, merubin b'sayev, when there is a lot of people violating these averas, so then they get killed b'sayev, and sayev is a lower level of capital punishment, and therefore their money is not going to the yorshim. Lefichach mamonan avit, the money gets lost and destroyed. So yachol, if we know that there's a difference between a yachid and between the tzibur in regards to these areas by skila and by sayev, yachol nachlok b'korbanos. Maybe we should say that there's a difference in what types of korbanos they would bring had it been a case of shogeg between a yachid and the rabbin. We didn't see that above. So how do we understand this Gemara? We're trying to figure out how Rebbe uses the word Torah achas. Says the Gemara right here, Talmud lomar Torah achas yalochem. That no, the korbanos don't change when they are when they've done things b'shogeg. Asks the Gemara, that's not so simple. The only reason why it's true that you say the korbanos don't change is because of the pasuk. If not for that, we would have thought that maybe there would have been a chiluk in the korbanos in the case of shogeg between yachid and tzibur. So the Gemara says that's impossible. My lesu, what different korbanos would you have brought? Lesu par, would you have brought a cow? That's not much of a chiddush because tzibur b'shar mitzvos udemaisu. If a tzibur makes an error in general with halacha, forget about avodas kochavim, so then they bring a par. What about a kispa? What about that animal? No, yachid b'shar mitzvos udemaisu. Nothing unique about that. What about seir? That animal is brought by a nasi b'shar mitzvos udemaisu. That animal is brought by a sar. Par la'ola b'sar lechatas. Those korbanos are brought in a case of tzibur v'avodas kochavim udemaisu. Belamai seira. What are we going to say? That animal? No, yachid nami hainu korbano. So therefore, we don't really know what Rebbe is trying to say with Torah achas, because if the havamina is that it would have been different, and therefore we need the word Torah achas, but the havamina is wrong. The havamina, there's no way it could have been different because there's no other options. So why does Rebbe need Torah achas? So says the Gemara, Itzrich, really he does need Torah achas because Sal kadaita chamina hol v'tzibur behora maisu par leola v'sar lechatas inhu nami nesu ipcha. They could have brought the reverse of these korbanos. Instead of par la'ola and sar lechatas, it could have been par lechatas and sar la'ola. Those are, in fact, different korbanos for different purposes. And maybe we would have thought that the korbanos should change. Inami, or no, sarich, he does need to bring different korbanos, but he has no resolution. And therefore, kamash malan, the word Torah achas to teach us that, yes, they do bring the same korbanos when they are b'shogeg. All right, we're done with all the hard stuff. Says the Gemara, Amar le, Levi, Rebbe. This is a clean slate. We're going back to the Mishnah now. Levi asks Rebbe, my area datani tesvav. Why is it that our Mishnah only counts 15 of the 21 arayos? Why aren't 16 counted? Bilisni tes zayin. Now, obviously, one knew what the other was asking. When he said tes zayin, the other one knew what he was asking. So the Gemara says, Omar le, kimeduma, it appears to me, kimeduma li she'ein lo moach bekad kadot. It seems that he has no brain inside of his skull. My daitach. What are you talking about? Are you talking about a case of imo anusas aviv? Are you talking about that case that we should bring that into our Mishnah? Pause. Look at the sheets. That's the top case of the drawing here. You have a man named Yaakov. Yaakov is married properly to Chana. Yaakov violates Malka and has Shimon. Yaakov is married to Chana and they have Ruvain. Okay, and Ruvain is also married to two people. Ruvain is married to Sarah, regular community woman. And Malka is the woman that Yaakov violated. They were never married. And you can see from the blue dotted line here that Ruvain married the woman that Yaakov violated. That is a machlokes. Can Ruvain marry the woman that his father violated? Let's talk in lumdus. Is that considered knaf aviv? We know that you're not allowed to be intimate with a stepmother, obviously, even upon divorce, it's not allowed. But what if they were never married? Is marriage what creates the isser of that woman? Or no, even Tash Mishamita would, in which case Malka should be forbidden to Ruvain. And says the Gemara back inside, my daitach, imo anusas aviv. You want to bring Shimon's mother, who is, she was raped and she had a child, and she had Shimon, and Ruvain went to marry her. That's not so simple. The case of Imo Anusas Aviv is plukta de Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanani, who plukta lo kamairi. The reason this case is not supposed to be included in our Mishnah as the 16th case is because our Mishnah specifically has no cases that are subject to machlokes in it. And this case of whether or not Ruvain can marry Malka is a machlokes tanaim. And because the case of Aviv, Imo Anusas Aviv, because Malka, who was violated by Yaakov, but they were never married, because there's a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbanan as to whether or not Ruvain, Yaakov's son from a different marriage, from a different relationship, whether or not Ruvain can marry Malka. So therefore, we're not including it in our Mishnah. Maybe it's true according to some, but that's not going to be included.
Is there enough between like actually violated or just, they got together without being married?
Probably not. The only thing I can think of that might change that is that we know that there are a lot of people who don't have halachic marriages. Their Eidim are related to each other. They're not frum, they're not Shomer Shabbos, and that really can invalidate a marriage. So the Rishonim speak about this, that there's an idea that any Tashma Shamita that's L'Shem Kiddushin kind of helps to effectuate the Kiddushin. That's a possibility. So that might be a difference between these two. But the case here is a case of Anusa. It doesn't present a case where they had Tashmish Amita. Yeah, I presume it's very specific, but I'm not 100% sure. So says the Gemara, fine. Why is it not 16 cases? Why don't we include the case of Imo Anusas Aviv? Because there's a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon as to whether or not that case is allowed, whether or not Ruvain in the first picture here is allowed to marry Malka. Okay, Velo, are you sure that there's nothing in our Mishnah that has a case of machlokas? Because we have another case in a different Mishnah in this Masechta where there is machlokas. What are the two cases? V'harei Isser Mitzvah, Isser Kedusha. These are two different cases. Isser Mitzvah we're going to learn about, not today and not for a bit, but we will learn about it. It's called Arayos, Shnios La Arayos. We're going to discuss this later, not now. In a case of Isser Mitzvah or in a case of Isser Kedusha, where a man marries a mamzeres, to pligi Rabbi Akiva v'Rabban. And there's a machlokas there, v'katani. Yet in the later part of the Masechta, it is listed. So you can't tell me that every case that's listed here is always going to be without machlokas, because that case is listed and it has a machlokas. Says the Gemara, no, but Pirkin Karmina. In Perek Rishon, the Mishnayos don't have a machlokas about the cases about Yibum. So therefore, it's not going to be included in our Mishnah. It's not going to be 16. It's going to be 15. We have a case that we're not going to look up right now, but it's a case that is later in the Masechta and 4 more blot, later in the Perek, where Beis Shammai allowed the tzaros to get married to certain people, and Beis Hillel did not allow. So says the Gemara, yeah, but who cares? Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel in a Mishnah. That's not Torah. That's not even a machlokas. We are just not gores to shita Beis Shammai. So we've seen this idea in Shas a number of times. Where was the last time we saw it? Brachos and Beit. So we've seen it twice. This is the third time where we see that that Beis Shammai b'makom Beis Hillel in a Mishnah. We don't even register his shita. It is a total flat line on the radar. Nothing. We totally ignore it. And therefore, even though it's in the first parak, and even though it says Beis Shammai says X and Beis Hillel says, we don't care. That's not a machlokas, and that case can be included in that Mishnah. Says the Gemara, but wait one second. There's a case of, this is on the bottom of this first page that we're going to look at in a minute, a case of Eshes Achiv, the wife of a brother, when the brother was Shelo Haya Be'olamo, top of Daf Testament base, Depligi Reb Shimon v'Rabbanan Biktani. That case we have listed, even though there's a machlokas. So what's going on? Look at the bottom of the first page here. The case says Eshes Achiv Shelo Ba Be'olamo. There are two possible cases here. This requires following along in addition to listening. There are 3 brothers, Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi in the black font. 3 brothers. Fine. Ruvain is married to Chana, and Ruvain dies without children. Shimon is married to Rachel, and Rachel, if she were to have gotten married, would be Tzaras Chana. If Shimon marries, what was the case here? I think I made a mistake here. Hold on one second. Reuven is married to Shimon, and Reuven's married to Chana. Why is Rachel Tzaras Chana?
She's a sister. No.
I think you are right, actually. I think they are. Are they sisters? Hang on. There's a
line in yellow.
I know. Oh, I understand what happened here. Okay, good. So Ruvain was married to Chana. Ruvain died. And then Shimon did Yibum. Got it. Okay, Shimon did Yibum. Thank you. Shimon is now married to 2 people. Shimon is married to Chana, and Shimon is married to Rachel, who is now Tzaras Chana. And then Shimon dies. Look at the green font there. Before, born after Ruvain died, but before Shimon married Chana.
Yeah.
Levi was born after Ruvain died, so there's no Yibum.
Yeah.
So Levi's not, no, he's never allowed to marry Chana.
Before the Yibum was completed by Shimon.
Correct. So in this case, it's pretty, there's no machlokas in this case that, there's no machlokas in this case. Can Levi ever marry Chana? It says in the red font there by the arrows, Eshes Ach, there's no Yibum, he can never marry. What about Levi marrying Rachel when Shimon dies? So also no Yibum, not allowed, because Chana is always forbidden to him, and Chana and Rachel are tzaros. Where is there no machlokas? That's on the left side in version 2. Same case, except that Levi was born after Shimon married Chana, after the Yibum. If Shimon then dies, then there's a machlokas if he can marry Chana. So that's what we're talking about in version 2 here. In this version 2, that's what it says on the top line, Depligi Reb Shimon v'Rabbanan v'Ktani. So because there's a machlokas in version 2 where Reb Shimon and Rabbanan don't necessarily agree, they don't agree, yet we still see that it's listed in a brisa. Says the Gemara, Benolad ulevisof yivim lo palig Reb Shimon. In case 1, they don't argue. So he gives a new kimta that we're talking about case 1, we're not talking about case 2. Says the Gemara, that really Rav Oshia says that there was a machlokas even in case 1. So therefore, maybe it should not be listed. Says the Gemara, ha'itos of Rav Oshia. We've already rejected the sheet of Rav Oshia. So now we have a version here which no one argues with, which is where Levi was born after Ruvain died, but before Shimon married Chana. Everyone agrees in that case that he's not allowed to marry Chana. Then says the Gemara, and this is where things get interesting. Then says the Gemara, the Amar of Yehuda Amar Rav, v'chein tani Reb Chia, v'chein tani Reb Chia. So these next 2 lines are cryptic, and without Rishonim, and I don't even know how the Rishonim figured it out, but without Rishonim it would be very difficult. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rab, Bekulan, in all of the cases of our Mishnah where we speak about arayos, with all 15 arayos, I have a case of Ani kore bahen ha'asura lazeh muteres lazeh, v'asura lazeh muteres bazeh. That when one sees one of 2 women that he could marry, he's allowed to marry one and is not allowed to marry another. Ve'achosa shehi yevimto, and the sister who would be the Yevama, which makes no sense, would be choletzes o misyabemes. Okay, now let's look at the picture on the back of page 1, the one that says family of brothers and family of sisters. Let's follow along in this chart, and then we will be able to learn the rest of this Gemara. Family of brothers, 4 brothers, Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, and 2 sisters, Leah and Rachel. Ruvain was married to Rachel. Shimon was married to Leah. And then Ruvain and Shimon die, and now there are 2 brothers, Levi and Yehuda. Now Levi and Yehuda, where the yellow arrows, Levi will marry, in theory, Rachel, and Yehuda, in theory, will marry Leah. We don't allow that. Look at the yellow font underneath, chalitza, but not yibum. Why? Here is a very important principle called zika. Since each woman has zikas yibum to all brothers, and a man can't marry the sister of his zikuka. Namely, the yibum of Levi applies to both women, and the yibum of Yehuda applies to both women. So therefore, because in theory, the zika, the bond that exists between these 2 living brothers of Levi and Yehuda could apply to both, you therefore cannot do yibum to either. Because there's this zikas yibum. Rashi here has a crazy language in Dibur HaMaskil, in the very long Rashi there. And he says a language where, let me see if I can just pull it out quickly. He says, it's I can't find it right now, but he basically says it's kind of like a form of kiddushin. It's kind of like a form of marriage. It's not fully a form of marriage, but it's similar to a form of marriage. So therefore, because in theory, Levi has a burden of yibum to both Leah and Rachel, and Yehuda has the same one, they can't do yibum. But they're also not patur from yibum, so they have to do chalitza. However, follow along in the green on the top, What happens if Rachel is really the mother-in-law of Yehuda, and Leah is the mother-in-law of Levi? Then there's no zika in both directions. Why? Because Levi has no zikas yibum to Leah. That's his mother-in-law. His only eligible person is Rachel. And Yehuda, whose mother-in-law is Rachel, has no zikas yibum to Rachel, but can easily marry Leah. So now let's read the green font here. If Leah is the mother-in-law of Levi, and if Rachel is mother-in-law to Yehuda from previous marriages, then we don't need to fall back on chalitza, since the typical zikas yibum doesn't apply when the mother-in-law are erva to her own son. Therefore, says Rav Chia, ha'asura bazeh muteres bazeh. Let's look at Levi. Levi can't marry Leah, but he can marry Rachel b'yibum, because there's no erva between Levi and Rachel, but there is erva between Levi and Leah. So that is what the Gemara means here. And that's why this Rashi is so long. Because what we're trying to do, let's go back in the Gemara. The Gemara says in the name of Rav and in the name of Rav Chia, 5th line on Daf Testament Beis, Bekulan ani kore. In all cases, I could figure out, in all 15 cases of arayos that are listed in our Mishnah, I could come up with a model like the one we just described, where ha'asura lazeh muteres lazeh, va'asura lazeh muteres lazeh. And check this out. Ve'achos shehi yevimto, choletzes omis yabemes. The sister is also going to be your Yevama. Because yes, if I'm Levi, then Leah is my mother-in-law, but her sister is my Yevama. So that is what Rabbi Chia said, this very sophisticated line where he indicates that we're able to view all of our cases in the Mishnah through this lens of being able to marry one person, but not being able to marry another. However, while it's true that Rabbi Yehuda Marav and Rabbi Chia said it applies to all 15 in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Mitargim Mechamos Ba'elach. It doesn't apply to the first 6. It only applies from number 7 and on in the list of our Mishnah. Aval Shisa Bave Deresha, but in the first 6 cases, low. It's not true. My taima, because one of the first ones in the Mishnah is bito. Kevan de bito be'onsin mishkachas la. The only way we could create our case here to fulfill the dictum of Rav Chia that it's asura lazeh and muteris lazeh, the only way that case can be created is if there was a violation, if there was a rape of some kind. Benisuin lo mishkachas la, but in a regular marriage case, it cannot be figured out. So, and our Mishnah is benisuin kamari, ba'onsin lo kamari. So therefore, because our Mishnah is only dealing with marriage, even this case that we just dealt with now, this case is a case of marriage. It's a very complicated family tree. I don't recommend it to people, but if it were to happen, at least with their marriages, it's not rape like it was in the previous cases. So the Mishnah wants to say, the Gemara wants to say in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, the Amora, that no, that this cannot be our case. We're only talking about marriage. Why do you have to exclude that case? We could even apply to the first 6 cases. Since we have a case where we could fulfill the dictum of Reb Chia that asura lazeh and muteris bazeh, either way, it should still be. Who cares if the Mishnah is talking about marriage or a woman who was vayed? It doesn't matter. Aval, however, says Abaye, Eishes achiv shelo haya be'olamo lo. But the case that we were talking about earlier, the 2 versions of Eishes achiv shelo haya be'olamo, that's not going to be a case that we will factor in. That's one of the last cases of our Mishnah, my taima, because Kevan de Reb Shimon hu de mishkachas la, since it only works according to one shita, and l'Rabbanan lo mishkachas la, then beplugta lo kamairi. Our Mishnah is not dealing with machlokas, and therefore this case cannot apply there. Rav Safra Matargim, Rav Safra disagrees, and he says, "Af eishes achiv shelo haya be'olamo." I disagree with you. Umishkachas la. Where do we find the case in the case of eishes achiv? Okay, it says the Gemara, Mishkachas la b'shisa achim ve'aliba de Reb Shimon. When there are 6 brothers, I can't even say the words. When there are 6 brothers, according to the opinion of Reb Shimon. Take a look at the last page here. 9 minutes until Mincha. We're perfect. 6 brothers. The father is Yaakov, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun. Please follow the little notes at the top there where it says 1, 2, and 3 because they die in a very specific order. Reuven is married to Leah, as you can see in the blue, and Shimon is married to Rachel. And with those asterisks, you can see that those are sisters. For the first part of our conversation, Yisachar and Zvulun are not yet born. And then Reuven dies. Look at note number 1. After Reuven died, then Yisachar was born. Then Levi married Leah through Yibum. Yisachar will always be usher to Leah since she's Eishes Ach, and he has no heter of Yibum because he was born after the fact. Then Shimon dies. After Shimon dies, Zvulun is born, the last child. Then Yehuda, who is the 4th child, he marries Rachel with Yibum. Zvulun, who was born after the fact, will always be usher to Rachel since she is Eishes Ach and has no heter of Yibum. And then Levi and Yehuda die. Now what? Now Levi and Yehuda are married to Rachel and Leah respectively, and Yisachar is always going to be usher to one of them, and Zevulun will always be usher to one of them because they were born after the fact and there's no Yibum to be matir. And therefore, Yisachar is usher to Leah but mutter to Rachel. Zevulun is usher to Rachel but mutter to Leah. That is what Rav Chia said. We have a case scenario where 2 sisters, one is mutter to marry one and not the other. We don't even treat them as tsaros because they weren't married to the same person. It's just mutter. And that's why this case is included in our Mishnah. That's what the Gemara says here, V'aliba de Reb Shimon. It's only according to Reb Shimon. At the very bottom of this page, you see that there's a machlokas. Reb Shimon agrees with this, but the Chachamim at the very bottom of this colored page says, Yisachar and Zvulun are usher to both of them. They're never allowed to marry. What do we see according to Reb Safra? We see that there's a case of machlokas that's included in our Mishnah. How can that be? We said that nothing in our Mishnah is going to be included with a case of machlokas. And by the way, v'simanech, a way to remember this case, thanks for giving it to me now, the way it's easiest to remember is Meis Nolad V'Yabim. A person died, another child was born, and then Yibum took place. A person died, another one was born, and then Yibum took place. And if you look at the brothers, you look back at that last picture that we just saw, you'll see Reuven died, Yisachar was born, Levi did Yibum. Shimon died, Zvulun was born, Yehuda did. So that's up the siman. So says the Gemara, this is a problem. It's a problem for Rebbe because Rebbe seemed to say that this should not be in our Mishnah. Therefore,
why did the Rabbanan? Why are they more makar in that case against Rav Shimon? They said that both were awesome.
probably because it's achos isha, in addition to eshes ach.
Even though the Yibum kind of made one of them mutter.
But we know from our Mishnah and from some of our other dialogues that Yibum works with the one level of Isser of eshes ach. But when there's any other level of arayos, which is the crux of our first Mishnah, it ruins Yibum. But here things are a little bit different. This six brothers case, the Shisa Achin, is a little bit different. I'm guessing. What?
What's the arayos?
Achos isha can't marry. No, it's not. No, it says mutter. I don't know why he says it's usher.
It's certainly usher for the brother who wasn't born yet, but for the one that was, like the logic.
Well, there's no.
Rav Shimon should stand.
The logic of Rav Shimon should stand. It's true. Let's see if
Really
it doesn't according to them. But let's see if the Gemara says here. Yeah, I don't know. The Gemara doesn't even reference this. It just says it's a liba de Rav Shimon.
Right.
I have no idea. Okay, when the bitum took my oh no, that's different. I'll look it up later. I'm not sure. Good question. And then the last line is Ela Rebbe Hani Klale Leisa. He doesn't agree to the klalim of Reb Chia and Rav to say that every single case in our Mishnah can be explained of Asura Lazeh and Mutaris Bazeh. We're going to stop right here. We'll pick up. I don't even know what we're doing tomorrow. We'll have to do it after the early Shacharis. We'll do Daf Yomi after the early Shacharis. Depending on how hard the Gemara is, I'll try to do a blot and a half. If not, then we'll have to learn Friday morning also because we gotta make up for lost time. Wishing you all a beautiful night.